It's 9:23 on a Tuesday morning. Nathan Cole is sitting in his car in the parking garage of a building he has worked in for 7 years. He has been sitting there for 22 minutes. The meeting starts at 9:30. He knows what he wants to say. He has rehearsed it. He has the data, the slides, the argument. He has prepared more thoroughly for this presentation than for anything in the last 3 years. And he cannot get out of the car. Not because he's afraid of the room, because he's afraid of what the room will think of him. His director will be there. 3 senior colleagues who have never particularly warmed to his ideas. The new VP from the London office, someone he's never met. Someone whose opinion he has spent 11 days imagining, simulating, adjusting for. And so Nathan Cole, 32 years old, Nashville, Tennessee, one of the most technically capable analysts in his department, is sitting in a parking garage at 9:23 a.m., being slowly eaten alive by people who haven't thought about him once this morning. He doesn't know that yet. He doesn't know a lot of things yet. He doesn't know that what's happening to him has a precise name, that it has been studied, mapped, and solved, that a philosopher born in slavery 2,000 years ago identified the mechanism, built the cure, and laid it out in language so clear it has survived the collapse of the civilization that produced it. He doesn't know that by the time he walks out of that building today, he will have found the thing that has been costing him years. This is the story of how one man stopped living inside other people's heads, and why the Stoics cracked this problem long before psychology gave it a name. Here's what nobody tells you about caring what people think. It doesn't feel like fear. That's why it's so hard to recognize and so easy to justify. It feels like professionalism. It feels like social awareness. It feels like the reasonable concern of a person who understands that reputation matters, that impressions stick, that how you're perceived in a room shapes what doors open and which ones stay closed. All of that is true. None of that is what's actually happening. What's actually happening in the parking garage, in the sleepless calculation before the difficult conversation, in the words you swallowed because you weren't sure how they'd land, is something older and more irrational than career strategy. It is the terror of the social animal. Humans are wired for group acceptance with an intensity that most people spend their entire lives underestimating. For the overwhelming majority of human history, rejection by the group was not embarrassing. It was lethal. The individual who was cast out of the tribe did not survive the season. The brain that evolved under those conditions built one of its most powerful drives around a single imperative: do not be rejected. That drive is still running, full strength. In a parking garage in Nashville, in the 21st century, in a man with a job and a mortgage and no genuine survival threat anywhere near him, the trigger has not updated to the era. Nathan Cole was not afraid of losing his life in that conference room. He was afraid of the look, the quiet skepticism on a senior colleague's face, the VP from London who might raise an eyebrow in the wrong direction, the silence after his opening slide that might go 1 second too long. He was afraid of being looked at and found insufficient. And that fear, ancient, biological, disproportionate to every actual consequence, had parked him in a garage for 22 minutes and was about to cost him 7 more years if something didn't change. Nathan Cole had been managing this particular fear his entire adult life. Not dramatically. He wasn't paralyzed. He wasn't reclusive. On most metrics, professionally, socially, relationally, he functioned well. But there was a specific ceiling. Every time he reached the edge of what was safe, the idea that was genuinely bold, the opinion that diverged from the room, the decision that prioritized his own judgment over the consensus, he pulled back. Not once, every time. It had started early. He was the youngest of 3 brothers in a household where his father had strong opinions and expressed them loudly, and where being wrong in front of the family had a social cost that shaped the neural architecture of a child still learning what safety felt like. He learned before he was old enough to name it that other people's perceptions were a currency, that approval was a resource that needed to be managed, that the safest strategy was always the one most likely to generate the least disapproval. By the time he was 32, that strategy had made him skilled, careful, thoroughly respected, and completely stalled. Because the ceiling is always in the same place. The ceiling is exactly at the edge of what other people will definitely approve of. And what other people will definitely approve of is never the thing that changes anything. His director had told him 2 years ago in a performance review that Nathan had replayed approximately 300 times since, that he was one of the sharpest analysts on the team. but that he seemed to hold back. That his instincts in one-on-one conversations were consistently stronger than what showed up in group settings. His director didn't know why. Nathan didn't tell him. The reason was that in a one-on-one conversation, Nathan was performing for one person. One person was manageable. One person's reaction could be read and responded to and adjusted for in real time. A room full of people was a room full of simultaneous verdicts that could not all be monitored at once. A room was uncontrollable. And uncontrollable was, for Nathan Cole, a specific kind of nightmare. He was 43 minutes late to the meeting. Not the 9:30. He made the 9:30 by sheer momentum, the clock forcing him out of the car when his mind could not. He walked in, he delivered the presentation. It went objectively, by any reasonable measure, well. The data was solid. The VP from London asked two good questions. His director nodded in the way that meant something real. But Nathan heard almost none of it. He was busy watching faces. 11 people in that room, and he had a partial read on 11 sets of facial expressions simultaneously. Was that a skeptical brow from Marcus, the senior analyst? Was that silence from David too long? Did the VP's second question carry genuine interest or veiled critique? He processed the responses the way a pilot processes instrument panels in turbulence, rapid, constant, high stakes, exhausting. And he got it wrong. At lunch, afterward, his colleague Priya told him it had gone well. Marcus thought your methodology was solid, she said. He told me after. Marcus. The skeptical brow. The colleague Nathan had mentally written off as hostile before he'd even spoken a word. And the VP? Nathan asked. Seemed engaged. Asked you two questions. They felt like challenges. Priya looked at him the way people look at someone who is clearly suffering a distortion they can't quite see yet. Not unkindly, just with the precision of someone observing a pattern from the outside. They were just questions, Nathan. He ate his lunch. But that sentence sat somewhere different from where lunch went. They were just questions. He'd spent 43 minutes in a parking garage and approximately 9 hours of the previous 11 days constructing a version of other people's internal states that bore almost no relationship to their actual internal states. He'd been living inside a simulation, an elaborate, detailed, self-authored simulation of what other people were thinking, and that simulation had been running his life. He went home that evening and, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, started reading. He'd been given a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations 18 months earlier by a colleague who'd moved to a different company. It had sat on his shelf, mostly decorative, next to 3 books he'd also never finished. He opened it that evening at 7:40 p.m. He read for 90 minutes without stopping. Not because the prose was gripping, Aurelius wrote in the private shorthand of a man reminding himself of things he already knew, not for an audience, but because the content was accurate in a way that felt almost invasive. How much more harmful are the consequences of anger and grief than the circumstances that arouse them in us? It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own. That second line, he read it 3 times. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own. Marcus Aurelius wrote that in the 2nd century AD, at the height of his power, the most powerful human being alive, commanding the largest empire on earth, he was writing in his private journal about the absurdity of the approval-seeking mind, the most powerful man in the world, struggling with the same trap. Nathan set the book down. He thought about Marcus in the parking garage, not literally, but the architecture, the emperor of Rome, in the full authority of his position, still having to remind himself that other people's opinions were none of his business was not comfort exactly. It was something more useful. It was evidence that this was not a personal failure. It was a human design flaw with a human design solution. And the solution was not careless. It was never careless. The Stoics were not teaching indifference. They were teaching something much more precise. The precise thing they were teaching has 3 parts, and each part is a direct surgical strike on the mechanism that creates the problem. Part 1. The judgment belongs to you, not them. Epictetus' slave, philosopher, the man whose ideas Marcus Aurelius spent his reign trying to live by, opens the Enchiridion with a statement that most people read too quickly to understand how radical it is. Some things are in our control and others not. Everything external is in the second category, including and this is where most people stop reading carefully what other people think. Other people's opinions are not in your control. They are not your property. They exist inside another person's skull, shaped by variables you had no part in creating. Their childhood, their mood this morning, the meeting they had before yours, the argument they had last week, the insecurity they've been carrying since 2019. Their opinion of you is assembled from data points you did not choose, processed by a brain you cannot access in a context you cannot fully know. It is not yours. Worrying about it is not diligence. It is trespassing in a space that does not belong to you, using cognitive resources that are desperately needed elsewhere. The Stoics did not say other people's opinions don't exist or don't matter in a practical sense. Of course they exist. Of course they have practical consequences. Marcus Aurelius understood that the Senate's opinion of him had very real downstream effects on the empire. But he made a distinction fierce, practiced daily between what is real and what is jurisdiction. Other people's opinions, real, not his jurisdiction. His own conduct, his own character, his own choices, real, entirely his jurisdiction. Everything he could control was on the inside of that line. Everything he couldn't was on the outside. Part 2. The audience is imaginary. This is the most uncomfortable part, and the most important. The version of other people that Nathan Cole was afraid of in that parking garage was not Marcus. It was not the VP from London. It was not his director or Priya or anyone else with blood and a heartbeat. It was a character he had written, a composite, an editorial, a projection assembled from fragments of past interactions, assumptions about personality, and the general architecture of a mind that had learned, before it was fully formed, to treat other people's perceptions as a survival variable. Nathan Cole had been afraid of his own imagination for 32 years. And his imagination is meticulous. It is creative. It produces high-resolution versions of rejection that are vivid enough to feel like memory and persuasive enough to feel like prediction. They are neither. They are fiction. They are stories the brain generates to prepare for threats that, in most cases, never arrive in the form imagined. The senior colleague with the skeptical brow was thinking about his own presentation or his lunch or the conversation he needed to have with HR that afternoon. The VP from London was asking genuine questions because she was genuinely interested. The room was not a jury. It never was. The jury was always internal. Part 3. Your character is the only verdict that counts. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect." This is the final move, and it is the one that produces the most durable freedom. When your primary concern is your own conduct, whether you said what you actually believed, whether you prepared with genuine integrity, whether you showed up with the quality of character you want to be known for, the audience becomes irrelevant. Not because you stop caring about people, because you have relocated the verdict to a court you control. The question shifts from what will they think to what do I know about the quality of what I just did? One question is answered by other people. One is answered by you. The man who lives in the first question is a hostage. The man who lives in the second is free. Here is what the neuroscience says and why it confirms what the Stoics built from pure observation. The brain has a system called the default mode network. It activates when you're not focused on a task, when your mind wanders, when you daydream, when you replay a conversation or pre-experience an upcoming event. Neuroscientists initially thought this network was just background noise, idle processing. They were wrong. In 2001, studies began revealing that the default mode network is specifically active during social cognition, during the mental simulation of other people's thoughts, reactions, and judgments. What we call rumination, self-consciousness, social anxiety, these are largely the output of an overactive default mode network running unsupervised. Nathan Cole in the parking garage, default mode network at full power, simulating 11 different people's simultaneous reactions to him before any of them had reacted. This is not abnormal. This is the standard operation of a socially aware human brain under perceived threat. The problem is that the default mode network is not a reliable narrator. It is a simulator, not a mirror. It produces approximations, sometimes useful, often wildly inaccurate of other people's internal states, assembled primarily from our own fears and previous experiences, rather than from anything we could actually verify. Studies on social anxiety consistently show a gap of between 40 and 60% between how negatively anxious people predict they'll be perceived and how they are actually perceived. Read that number again, 40 to 60%. The version of events Nathan Cole was preparing for was, on average, half imaginary. The Stoics had no brain scans. They had 2,000 years of careful human observation. And they arrived at the same place, that the suffering caused by other people's opinions is almost entirely manufactured by the person doing the suffering. Not their fault, but their responsibility. Nathan read Meditations in 4 evenings. He did not become a different person. That is not how this works. And any script that tells you otherwise is selling something you cannot buy. But he began a practice. Small, unglamorous. The kind of practice that looks like nothing from the outside and rebuilds everything from the inside. Every morning, before he left for the office, he asked himself one question. Not, how will I come across today? Not, what will they think of me in the meeting? One question only. What is the quality of what I'm bringing today? Am I prepared? Yes. Do I believe what I'm about to say? Yes. Is my argument built on honest analysis rather than the desire to be agreed with? Yes. Then the rest is not my jurisdiction. He called it his 5-second audit. It took less than that, most days. The answers were almost always yes, because when you've prepared with integrity and believe what you're saying, the audit is brief. The question did not eliminate social awareness. It did not make him indifferent to how he was received. He still cared about communication, about clarity, about landing his ideas well, but it relocated the primary verdict. The primary verdict was no longer, what do they think? It was, what do I know? And what he knew when he was honest, which the practice forced him to be, was almost always sufficient. The second practice was simpler and harder. After any significant social interaction meeting, presentation, difficult conversation, he gave himself a deliberate 2-minute period to sit with whatever happened, not to replay it, not to rerun it for alternative outcomes, not to audit other people's facial expressions in retrospect, to simply ask, did I conduct myself with the quality I intended? If yes, the interaction was a success, regardless of outcome. If no, he noted specifically what he would do differently, not what they thought of him, what he would change about his own conduct. That was the only data that belonged to him. That was the only data worth keeping. Here is where most people push back, because this sounds, on first reading, like a prescription for not caring. And not caring has a cost. The person who genuinely doesn't care what anyone thinks is not enlightened. They are dangerous. They miss feedback that matters. They repeat mistakes. They alienate people whose relationships are genuinely valuable. They confuse freedom with indifference and produce a version of themselves that is technically unaccountable. The Stoics were not teaching this. This is the misreading that turns philosophy into an excuse. The dichotomy of control, the line between what is yours and what is not, does not draw the line at caring. It draws the line at what kind of caring is useful. Marcus Aurelius cared deeply about how Rome perceived its emperor. He cared about reputation in the sense that a man's reputation reflects his character, and character was the only thing he was certain he had full jurisdiction over. But he did not construct elaborate internal simulations of what the Senate thought about him before he fell asleep. He did not delay decisions because he was waiting for unanimous approval. He did not shrink his judgment to fit the imagined comfort level of the room. He asked, did I act from virtue, from genuine reasoning, from the best version of my own judgment? If yes, the verdict is settled. Other verdicts from people with incomplete information, biased perception, self-interested interpretation are data points, not authority. They are worth listening to. They are not worth being ruled by. There is a difference between receiving feedback with genuine openness and living in terror of a verdict that may not reflect reality and may not arrive at all. The first is growth. The second is a cage. Nathan Cole had been in the cage. What the Stoics offered was not the absence of the cage. It was the key. There is one layer beneath all of this that most people never reach, and it is the most important one. The reason other people's opinions have so much power is not because their opinions are accurate. It is not because the consequences of disapproval are as severe as the amygdala insists. The reason they have power is because, at some level, we agree with them. The man who is terrified of being found insufficient is not afraid of a stranger's verdict. He is afraid that the stranger will confirm what he already suspects about himself. This is the hidden architecture of almost all social anxiety. The fear of being seen through, the fear that the skeptical brow, the delayed approval, the ambiguous silence will reach in and confirm the private doubt that never fully quieted. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not enough. Maybe the thing I'm most afraid they'll see is actually there. The Stoics understood this. Epictetus, in particular, wrote about it with the directness of a man who had nothing left to lose through honesty. He said, "If you wish to be calm in the face of others' opinions, examine your own first. Not your accomplishments, your character. Not whether you are impressive, but whether you are honest, whether you are consistent, whether you behave the same in rooms where no one is watching as in rooms where everyone is. Because the man whose private life and public life are aligned, the man who knows that what he presents is accurate, does not live in terror of being seen. He is already seen by the only judge whose verdict is permanent, himself." This is the radical proposition of Stoic philosophy in the context of social approval. It is not stop caring what people think. It is build a self whose character is clear enough to you that other people's opinions become information rather than verdicts. When you know who you are, when you have examined yourself with the same rigor you'd apply to anything else that matters, the room's opinion is no longer a referendum on your existence. It is feedback, useful sometimes, wrong sometimes, worth considering, not worth bleeding for. The philosophy is architecture. These are the tools. Practice 1, the pre-mortem on approval. Before any significant interaction where you notice the pull of other people's approval, a presentation, a difficult conversation, a creative risk, ask one question. If no one approved of this at all, would I still believe it was the right thing to do? Not would I be okay with it. Not would I survive. Would I still believe it was right? If the answer is yes, you have located your actual position. Do that. Say that. Bring that into the room. If the answer is no, if what you're planning to say or do or present exists primarily because you believe it will generate approval, rather than because you believe it is correct, stop. That is not your genuine position. That is the social animal performing. The Stoics called this checking your hegemonicon, your ruling faculty, the deepest seat of judgment and intention. Is what I'm about to do consistent with what I actually know? Do the check before you enter the room. Practice 2, the post-event audit. After significant interactions, take 2 minutes, not longer, to answer 2 questions. Did I conduct myself with the quality I intended? If not, what specifically would I change? Nothing else. Not what did they think, not how did it land, not what does it mean for my standing. Only your conduct. Only your own jurisdiction. This practice trains the brain to relocate the primary feedback loop from external to internal. Over time, weeks, not years, it changes what you reach for after a difficult interaction. The default question stops being what did they think and starts being what do I know? That shift is the whole game. Practice 3, the expansion test. This one is the most confrontational. Once a week, do one thing you know is right professionally, creatively, relationally that you have been avoiding because you are not sure how it would be received. Not something reckless, something genuine. The idea you've been sitting on, the opinion you've been qualifying to death. The decision you've made internally but haven't voiced because the room felt uncertain. Do it. Once, see what happens. What almost always happens is that the response is significantly less negative than anticipated because the imagined jury is always harsher than the actual one. More importantly, even when the response is genuinely difficult, even when the room doesn't warm to it and someone's brow does exactly what you predicted, you will discover that you survived it. That the verdict, even when it landed badly, did not determine your value. That knowledge earned through direct experience, not philosophy, is the foundation of genuine indifference to approval. Not the absence of care, the absence of terror. Let's be direct about the tax. Because this is not abstract. This is not an optimization question for people who want to feel better. This is a calculation with real numbers. The average high-functioning person who is significantly affected by social approval, by the need for it, the fear of losing it, The management of it operates at roughly 60 to 70% of their actual cognitive and creative capacity in group settings. The remaining 30 to 40% is allocated to social monitoring, watching faces, calibrating language, pre-adjusting opinions, swallowing the actual thought and substituting the safer version, running the background simulation of the room's verdict. 30 to 40% of your actual intelligence, of your actual ideas, lost to an audience that is mostly thinking about themselves. Nathan Cole was one of the sharpest analysts in his department. His director had told him so. His performance reviews confirmed it. The data was not in dispute. But for 7 years of meetings, presentations, strategic discussions, he had been operating at a significant fraction of his actual capacity. Not because of incompetence, not because of anything visible from the outside, because 30 to 40% of his cognitive resources were permanently deployed in the management of imaginary verdicts. That tax does not just cost you individual performances. It costs you the accumulation, the compounding, the version of your career and your relationships and your creative life that would have been possible if you had been fully present instead of partially hostage. That is not a small number. That is years. 6 months after the parking garage, Nathan gave the most important presentation of his career. A full strategic recommendation to reorient a significant part of the company's analytical infrastructure. His idea, his data, his genuine conviction developed over 2 years of observation that the current approach had a structural problem that was quietly costing accuracy across multiple departments. It was, by any standard, a contrarian argument. It would require senior leadership to acknowledge that the existing system, the one they had chosen, championed, and in some cases, built their reputations around, had a fundamental limitation. Nathan sat in his car before that presentation too. But he wasn't in the parking garage for 22 minutes. He was in the parking garage for 3. He asked his question, what is the quality of what I'm bringing today? Solid data, genuine conviction, honest analysis. 3 years of careful observation. Yes, yes, yes. Then the verdict belongs to me. He walked in. He delivered the argument without hedging, without the 14 qualifications he would have inserted 18 months earlier, without the softened conclusion that left him more comfortable but the room less certain. He said what he believed, fully, in the language it deserved. The room was quiet for a moment after he finished. His director said, "This is the most useful strategic argument I've heard in 2 years. Not unanimous agreement." 2 of the senior colleagues pushed back, hard, on specific data points. The VP from London, who had been in the original presentation 6 months earlier, asked sharp questions that required real answers. Nathan answered them. He didn't perform calm. He didn't manage their faces. He was simply too busy thinking to be afraid. That is what freedom from the approval trap actually feels like. Not the absence of pushback, not the comfort of unanimous agreement. The full use of your mind in rooms where your mind is needed. Marcus Aurelius died having ruled Rome for 19 years. He is remembered not for the battles he won, though he won many, not for the policies he enacted, though they were significant. He is remembered for a private journal that was never meant to be published, a document of a man attempting every day to be free of the approval of the very empire he commanded. He didn't always succeed. The journal is full of reminders, repetitions, the same principles returned to again and again, which tells you, if you read it carefully, that freedom from the approval drive is not a switch you flip. It is a muscle you build, a practice, not an achievement. Epictetus spent years in slavery and emerged with a philosophy that has outlasted every political system and empire that owned him. His freedom was never external. It was the internal freedom of a man who had located his value in the only place that cannot be taken by another person's opinion, in the quality of his own character, the honesty of his own judgment, the consistency of his own conduct when no one who mattered was watching. This is available to you, not the result of reading, not the result of inspiration, the result of practice, of the 5-second audit before the meeting, of the 2-minute debrief that asks only what you know, of the weekly act of doing the right thing even without a guaranteed audience for it. The approval of the room is a rented resource. Your own clarity is owned. Build the own thing. Before you close this video, I want you to locate something. Think about the thing you have been holding back. the opinion you keep qualifying, the idea you've been waiting to have received before you fully commit to it. The version of yourself you bring out only in one-on-one conversations, the sharper version, the more direct version, the one that recedes when the room gets larger. That is not the cautious version of you. That is the caged version. And the cage is not locked by anyone else. The Stoics did not teach you to stop caring about people. They taught you to stop confusing other people's opinions with your own identity. Those are not the same thing. You can care about the people in the room while being completely unafraid of their verdict. You can value relationships while not requiring them to constantly affirm your worth. You can receive criticism with genuine openness while knowing before you enter the room that the verdict on your character is not on the table. That verdict is already settled by you in the 3 minutes before you get out of the car. Do the audit. Walk in. If this reached something real, if you recognize something of yourself in Nathan's parking garage, share this with someone who needs it. Not everyone will admit they're sitting in their own garage, but most of them are. Subscribe if you want more, not for the numbers. Because there are people you know who are operating at 60% and they deserve the other 40. Go find them.